Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce today, in continuation of our Glaucur series lectures, Justine Howe. She's an associate professor and chair of religious studies at the Case Western Reserve University. She's the editor of Suburban Islam, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and the editor of the Routledge Handbook of Islam and Gender, 2020. Her new book project about Maryam Jamila, which is called Maryam Jamila and the Global Muslim Imagination, is forthcoming with Princeton University Press. Her title today for the talk, Quran Translation and Muslim Pamphlets, U.S. Muslim Pamphlets, Lived Religion, Revivalist Aspiration, and the Culture Wars. So I'm very pleased to host today Justine Howe, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for the very kind introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen since I have some slides. So flag me down if you can't see that. So I was really grateful for the invitation to come and discuss some new work with all of you related to Quran translations and U.S. Muslim pamphlets from the 1970s. And I'm going to be thinking about this genre of text in relation to three kind of themes. The first is lived religious practice, lived religion, revivalist aspirations of this period, and then finally the emerging culture wars in the United States that come on the heels of the social movements of the 1960s. So the two texts that I'm going to be thinking with today both relate to gender and sexuality. And women. They are texts that very much sit at the intersection of these three themes. So the first is The Status of Woman in Islam by Jamal Badawi, published in 1972. And also published in 1972, Marriage in Islam, a Manual by Muhammad Abdul Rauf. And so we'll be thinking around these texts for the duration of our time together. But I wanted to start by just thinking a little bit about pamphlets and what I'm calling prescriptive literature. Not all pamphlets necessarily prescribe or give guidelines about what to do, but these two pamphlets certainly fit into that category. So they are situated as these sort of small short books intended for mass publication. And they provide a really compelling window into what is happening on the ground, which is an interest of mine in terms of the Quran. So in this project, but also in my prior work, I've been very interested in what Muslims do with the Quran. And because I work on American Muslims, they're often doing things with the Quran in translation. And thinking about the ways in which these translations are structuring and making possible certain forms of interpretation in relation to daily and lived realities. I'm also interested in this talk and in this project about countering the perception that such texts are merely reductions or some sort of simplistic distillation of the Islamic tradition. As I think will become clear as we dig into these texts, they're anything but simple, and in fact are full of tensions that go unresolved. And in particular, one of the unresolved tensions within them is they sort of tack between an understanding of the United States as a dangerous place for Muslims, as a place that really challenges them in terms of living out an Islamic righteous kind of life. So there's that on the one hand, and then on the other, the idea that the United States is a really promising place for the practice of Islam, a place where Islam can thrive and grow, and there are tremendous opportunities for Muslims within an American context. So I'm focusing on the 1970s for a couple different reasons. One is that these two texts published in 1972 are part of a print media culture that really got going after the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which ended the very restrictive immigration quotas from Asia that were put in place in the early 20th century. And this is what enabled large numbers, tens of thousands of Muslim immigrants to arrive from Southeast Asia, as well as from the Middle East in greater numbers than they had in the past. And of course, Muslims were not the only religious minority to also come to the US, but this was a period of tremendous growth in terms of absolute numbers of Muslims in the US. And in particular, a certain demographic of Muslim immigrant who came in through the HB1 visa category as a way to recruit highly skilled laborers, scientists, engineers, doctors into the American workforce in the sort of Cold War environment. And as a result, the HB1 visa category also created the possibility for families to arrive in greater numbers than in previous waves of immigration. And this is a real period of institution and community building for these recently arrived immigrants, many of whom did not see, for example, Black Muslim communities that had begun to thrive in Northeastern and Midwestern cities from the Nation of Islam and other sort of Sunni Black Muslim communities. They did not see those communities as authentic representations of Islam. And so these pamphlets reflect this idea of needing a kind of ground up community building of which books and literature were a crucial part. So a lot of the scholarship on Islam in America from this period focuses on, kind of mosque building or institution building. And I am arguing here that, in fact, the print media piece is another really important aspect of what's going on. This is also a period, as I mentioned earlier, of intense consternation in the United States over gender and sexuality. So there are both the pieces of immigration, kind of the movement of Muslim diasporas around the globe, and then there is also the period in which we find ourselves, what we call the kind of emerging culture wars in the US, which we are unfortunately still waging more than ever. So the argument that I am going to lay out today is that recent Muslim immigrants in the 1960s and 70s adopt English translations of the Quran almost immediately in their prescriptive and ethical literature. So we'll see with Badawi's text that it's sort of transitional text in this way, but these cheap, short books and pamphlets that are aimed at how to be a good Muslim in the United States almost entirely rely upon English translations of the Quran to mediate the normative prescriptions of Islam with the daily challenges of living in the United States. And this produces all sorts of unresolved tensions between the meaning and interpretation of the Quran, the prescriptive aims of these texts, which promise to, provide definitive guidance, and then the daily challenges and realities that Muslims are facing. So one of the most interesting parts about these pamphlets is that they have multiple audiences and aims. So one of them is, in terms of audience, is that they are both primarily for Muslim audiences, but not exclusively for Muslim audiences. So in terms of Muslim audiences, they very clearly have a kind of revivalist aim in terms of reinvigorating daily practice, ensuring daily practice of prayer, etc., in the context of being a religious minority. As well as ensuring that certain obligations, such as marriage, are taking place in an Islamic way. But they also have non-Muslim audiences in mind as well. And this is a crucial piece of dawah in this period, as Zarina Grewal and others have argued, which is that it's not just about instructing or calling other Muslims to Islam and achieving that piece, but also always has this external feature, which is to educate non-Muslims about Islam. I would also add in there that many of these pamphlets implicitly, they don't tend to name this group, but I think are very much in conversation with thinking about how to educate converts about what Islam is and how to go about being a Muslim. So those are a couple of its audiences and aims. And then thirdly, I would say that these pamphlets are highly attuned to the political and cultural context. So they are attempting to both distill Islam in particular ways. I think that's correct. But then what is also happening is they're trying to be highly responsive to current political developments. So there are three different approaches to Quran translations that I want to highlight in my talk today. So the first one is as a subordinate interpretation of the Arabic text. So as we'll see, Badawi maintains the Arabic and then uses the Yusuf Ali translation as his interpretive framework. Abdul Rauf uses a cumulative or additive approach, which is selecting a whole bunch of individual verses from across different surahs to make a particular point or to respond to a rhetorical question that he poses. And Abdul Rauf, I believe, uses the Muhammad Shakir translation, though that one I still, to be honest, need to do a little bit more of a systematic kind of exploration of that, because I think he modifies certain translations and does not particularly cite the translation that he uses, which Badawi does. And then thirdly, a feature that they both share is using the Quran to provide knowledge of what is natural or physiological or biological or psychological about humanity, and then using that thread to provide guidance for how to organize gender roles, marriage, and sexuality. So this idea of the Quran exemplifying, elucidating what is natural about human beings and how their social life should take shape. All right, so I'm going to say a little bit more about the pamphlets, authors, and distribution. Then I'm going to talk about the status of women, status of woman in Islam, and then talk about the marriage manual, and finally to think about these texts in relation to the emerging culture wars, and then their broader revivalist and universalistic aims. So in terms of authors, Jamal Badawi, a very important figure in the creation of the Muslim Students Association, which was one of the largest national organizations in the 1960s and 70s. It very much had this aim of unifying Muslims across lines of difference in the US. Badawi came to the US from Egypt to be a graduate student at Indiana University, Bloomington, and was part of the founding leader in both that local chapter, but also in MSA National, and then later in the Islamic Society of North America, which is a large umbrella organization founded in the 1970s. A very key figure in terms of as an author, but also a public speaker, or sort of spokesperson for Islam throughout the 20th century. And then Muhammad Abdul Rauf, who began his career in Malaysia and then came to the US in the 1960s to serve as the director of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., a mosque that was built by during the Eisenhower administration. And Abdul Rauf approaches the marriage manual less so from his, well, he uses both his position as the director of the Islamic Center, but also as someone who has officiated a lot of weddings. So he sees himself as a kind of ritual practitioner on the ground, sort of feeling out what these different dynamics are. Okay, so as I mentioned, Badawi is part of the MSA. The MSA during this period was founding chapters, creating communities on local college campuses. But the other thing they were doing was churning out a whole bunch of print media, right? A lot of publications. So to give you a kind of flavor of what these publications looked like, they did a wide range of prescriptive literature. So the Parents Manual, which also came out in 1972, which I've written about elsewhere. They also did an Islamic correspondence course. So before we had remote learning, you could fill out answers, do a bunch of reading, answer exam questions, and then send them back to somebody for feedback and grading. And then Al-Ittihad, which is its monthly magazine. And the status of women in Islam as a publication began with Badawi's short articles that were published in Ittihad, and then became went through several editions as a pamphlet. So this is the sort of a couple different versions of the text. I did not spill coffee on the middle version. It was already well loved and well worn before it arrived in my office. But I wanted to share also the back cover with you, which gives you a sense of the other kinds of topics that were that were taken up by MSA authors during this period. And some of them are more prescriptive than others, but they are all aimed at trying to create an overarching understanding of what Islam is for American Muslims. Okay, so this is what the text looks, this is the structure of the pamphlet visually. And I am going to pay some attention, I'm going to pay more attention to the visual and structural elements of these texts than I am to the translations themselves. So if you're looking for like engagement in the kind of interpretation aspect, that's less of the focus of this talk, and more I'm interested in how they're marshaling the Quran in relation to other texts and the claims of the authors themselves. So this is what this looks like for Badawi. He starts with a kind of description of a point that he wants to make. So here he argues the Quran clearly indicates that marriage is sharing between the two halves of the society, and that its objectives, besides perpetuating human life through reproduction, are emotional well-being and spiritual harmony. Its bases are love and mercy. And so then he provides the Arabic. It's set apart in this bolded box of the verse that he is citing, and then followed by the English translation of the verse, which he relies upon to explain its meaning. So he does not himself then go about providing commentary. He uses the English translation as the interpretation of the Arabic. The one exception I have provided here is that he does sometimes provide occasional footnote commentary. So he will at times introduce different interpretations of the verse. So here, for example, he says that, you know, you might commonly find references to the male and the female in this verse as the mates, but he argues that that is not, that this is a less authentic interpretation. So this is what it looks like. So then he goes into that, and then he will at times refer to other texts, sometimes hadith. You'll see in this passage that he refers to Islamic law as like a concept, right? And here he's responding to, he wants to make 2 points. One, to emphasize the spiritual equality of men and women before God, the role of marriage in perpetuating divine attributes like love and mercy. And then lastly, to respond in a polemical way to charges that women are forced into marriage or don't have choice in their marital arrangements, to say that according to Islamic law, broadly conceived, women cannot be forced to marry anyone without their consent. Okay, so this is the general structure of what the status of women in Islam looks like. And this kind of transitional feature where we have the Arabic text maintained and then followed by English, the English translation, reflects the linguistic imperatives and challenges of the Muslim Students Association. So its members during the 1960s spanned an array of cultures and languages. And Badawi gave a really fascinating interview with Yasser Qadi recently that you can also find on YouTube if you want to hear some of his descriptions of what this period was like. And the linguistic question was front of their mind, right? What languages are we using? Obviously for ritual practice to retain the Arabic, but things like sermons, right? The literature they're producing, how they're reaching out to their fellow Muslims. How can they sort of, for converts, right, who may have no Arabic background whatsoever, how to kind of incorporate, cast a wide net for their membership. And so very quickly on, they decide on English as that mediating language. It also makes sense in a professional and educational environment where English is being used primarily. And I just want to say that I think it's important. It may seem like a really obvious or inevitable kind of outcome, but I think that it also stems from the particular orientation of early MSA leaders who wanted to emphasize they felt the imperative that there needed to be a unifying language for all Muslims. And in the American context, they felt that the right strategy would be to embrace the vernacular as soon as possible in order to accomplish these broader kinds of revivalist aspirations. Okay, so to give another example and to move to the third theme in terms of approaching the Quran in both Badawi's and Abdul Rauf's text, and this is the argument that is being made throughout, that what the Quran elucidates is what is natural for humanity, right? So this is, I've just lifted what Badawi is doing here in terms of making a point about the idea of Islam being consonant with quote unquote upright human nature. So he says the rules for married life in Islam are clear and in harmony with upright human nature. In consideration of the physiological and psychological makeup of man and woman, both have equal rights and claims on one another, except for one responsibility, that of leadership. So he makes that point first, and then again states the Quran in the Arabic, and then relies on the translation to prove his broader point, which is that while men and women have spiritual equality within the marriage itself, leadership belongs to the male partner. And so this is an argument that both hinges on the specificity of an Islamic claim about what gender roles ought to be, but it also hinges on the idea of what is natural in a broader humanistic sort of sense, consonant with science. And so what we see is this reference to what is biological, what is physiological, what is emotional. And based on then what is natural, Badawi then argues that what follows is a particular gender division of labor within the household. So he moves from the Quran to an argument about the necessity of mothers to take on the role of educating the moral education of children, to be upright, complex, free, more psychological language there. And that there are then physiological reasons why women ought to do this, right? That are reflected in the Quranic text. And that certain other dimensions of female capacities might be diminished should she take on other roles, such as that of a judge, or later he talks about how women should be restricted from occupying positions of political leadership. So what's interesting here for me is that on the one hand, Badawi is trying to set out a kind of regulation, right? That women in this case are naturally suited towards caregiving, toward the moral education of children, that this has to be done. It can't be waged labor in the sense of maids or babysitters, right? That's what differentiates them from one thing that differentiates them from a mother's labor. So there seems to be a kind of prescriptive piece here, but he also leaves open this window, right? That I think is a significant kind of complication of the prescription that he's trying to set forward, right? And so these kinds of tensions, I animate all of these pamphlets between what is understood to be inherent about gender roles, instantiated through the Quran, and then what the sort of daily realities of a more educated female workforce, of women entering into professions in greater numbers, this being true in the United States, but also in Muslim majority societies. And so what we see are these pamphlets really grappling with the kind of these kinds of tensions. Okay, I'm going to skip this. It's just too much. Okay, so what he's trying to do then is demonstrate, right, that the Quran affirms the spiritual equality of women, and that marriage provides social protection, right, in these various ways that are, in fact, not just what Islam requires, but that is actually natural and good more broadly. And so to do so, Badawi never relies on the Quran or Islam alone. He is also introducing notions of nature, of medicine, of science. This makes sense given a university environment where you have multiple forms of knowledge that are combining and intermixing in this particular environment. And in fact, his own religious authority is constructed in part through academic expertise, which is a model that we see for American religious authority more broadly. And then I also want to introduce the idea that he is, in the polemics that he engages vis-a-vis the status of women in, say, Christianity, which is the first part of this pamphlet, he uses other texts, right, that are designed again, I think, to speak to non-Muslim audiences who he uses middle-brow texts such as Encyclopedia Britannica to make claims about the comparison between European women and Muslim women, arguing, for example, that um, the status of women in Islam is much more elevated because women have always had the right to inherit property and to own property inherent from their parents, and European women using, so this is where he brings in the encyclopedia, have only recently gained that right. So there are ways in which the Quran exists alongside other texts, even though it takes this sort of primacy, but is within these pamphlets, it's a whole collection of different forms of knowledge alongside the interpretation and meaning of the Quranic text. And in addition to these multiple forms of knowledge, multiple forms of textual and scholarly authority, we also have different forms of status talk, what I would call status talk happening here, that are also making for a very complex set of arguments that I think partially explains why Badawi does not necessarily come down on the side of an entirely prescriptive, right? But he wants to leave open the possibility for kind of daily negotiations of some of these norms. So one, of course, is the colonial critique of the Muslim treatment of women, this idea of status of Islam in relation to other religions or quote unquote civilizations. Badawi is clearly responding to those well-worn kinds of tropes. He's also in invoking the idea of a mother in the context of a nuclear family, shaping the moral fabric of society through child rearing. These are clearly nationalist and post-colonial ideologies that, again, are not necessarily unique to an Islamic setting, but have a broader kind of resonance. And then he is also responding to American debates about feminism and rapid social change. So I think that is part of what is happening in terms of thinking about like women's political leadership or women's religious leadership, et cetera. And, you know, in the 1970s, when broader Americans were polled about whether a woman should be president or have a high office, it was something like only 40% said that that would be acceptable. And so it's, again, the idea that this is simply a Muslim response. I would say Badawi is also part of this broader kind of cultural conversation that is happening during that period. And then, of course, the multiple audiences and their expectations about, quote unquote, what the status of women in Islam actually is. Okay, so I want to turn to, let me just check my time here. I want to turn to the second text, which is the Marriage in Islam, a Manual by Muhammad Abdul Rauf. And you'll see, this is the cover, and there are three features that I want to emphasize here. The first is the exclusive use of the English translation. So there is no Arabic text that accompanies any kind of explanation or guidelines. He makes use of an additive or sort of cumulative approach, this idea of bringing together disparate verses from throughout the Quran to make a point or to respond to a rhetorical question that he poses. And one of the more striking structural features, visual features, is the ways in which the normative prescriptions, the text of the Quran, and then lived religion are very clearly in conversation with one another in a visual way. So this text promises to be a kind of how-to guide to Muslim marriage in the context of the United States. It's very, as I mentioned, this is somebody who has conducted many, many marriages. So he very much presents himself as aligned to the daily realities and challenges, not just for married couples, but the daily realities and challenges of American society. And he actually starts the book by talking about how his friends wanted him to write this book because they felt like something was deeply amiss with sex and sexuality in the US. And so he says in the beginning of the book, I don't even like to use the term. I don't even like to say sex like as a term out loud. But then a lot of the book is about that. And so he's very much like in the kind of daily practice. He's not afraid to kind of dig deeper. And so He's trying to also provide guidelines for interfaith marriages. So many of the manual's pages have pictures of Muslim men who marry Christian wives, and also mitigating, right? What are the core elements of a Muslim marriage if the couples are from different national or ethnic backgrounds? Like, what are some of the things that you do? Dowry, required ceremony elements, etc. The other thing that I want to point out is that the text takes for granted that Muslims will follow U.S. civil regulations for marriage. So there's also discussion of age requirements, marriage licenses, blood tests, etc. And so there's that piece, the kind of how to conduct a wedding, how to conduct a marriage, how does it work? And then there are also extended passages about how to be a good Muslim husband and wife. Again, multiple audiences here. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but Abdul Rauf is actually more explicit than I would say Badawi is about his non-Muslim audiences. He, I think, imagines this as like, oh, so you're the parent of a daughter who is getting married to a Muslim man. I'm going to go read about marriage in Islam because my daughter is about to have a Muslim wedding. And so that's who he sort of imagines the non-Muslim audience to be. And he also sees it as, again, as a response to what is happening in the United States. So we see this in the kind of idea that he presents here, that in the current turmoil of male-female relationships in Western society, I offered this as part of like a contribution to that conversation, to the sort of idea that there are these kind of real threats to the family structures and as a result to religious identity and practice among Muslims. So this is the additive kind of approach that I was talking about here. Here he poses a rhetorical question: is marriage desirable? And then, of course, the answer is yes. So marriage in Islam, he says, is strongly recommended on religious, moral, social, psychological, and physiological grounds. So here we have the invoking of the religious alongside the social, psychological, and physiological grounds, right? This idea of appeal to nature, of human nature. And then the selection of verses, and then you'll see hadith is much more prominent in the marriage manual than it is in Badawi's text, but then he also follows up with several traditions from the Prophet Muhammad. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of the interplay of Quranic interpretations alongside lived reality. So lived reality works in two different ways in this spread of pages, which are next to each other in the manual. So on the one hand, he starts by describing, right, all these dangers that are lurking for Muslims, like dating, especially premarital sex, which then he goes on to describe, right, the various social consequences of that, children born out of wedlock, et cetera. And then, right, the page is interrupted by these photos of happy couples getting married, which they're great. They're great photos. Love them. But I think they also are meant to serve as a kind of juxtaposition of like, oh, well, you can avoid all of these dangers by simply doing the right thing. And that is getting married, right? So you have those photos, and then the Quranic text is brought in, right? The interpretation, the translation is brought in as a punitive reminder, as a warning. This is what happens if you commit zina, right? And he brings in verses that are about punishment. So the Qur'an operates slightly differently here than in the additive approach, right? It serves as a warning if in your daily life you do not fulfill the principles that are set forward, and you want to both avoid the social consequences, but also the consequences, the divine retribution and consequences that you would be facing should you not choose this very attractive and happy path of getting married. And so part of what is running through both pamphlets is the idea of the nuclear family being central. So the Qur'an translations are used as a way of supporting this assumption that remains totally unstated, but is the case, which is that the nuclear family should be the primary unit of Muslim practice in the US. There are a lot of different reasons for this that I can talk about more, but the marshaling of the Quran, of interpretations of the Quran, to say that this is the natural form of human organization, companionate marriage, and that, as we'll see in a minute, that these manuals often task individual families with working out what it means to be Muslim and what is actually required of them. So other institutions, other communities are not uplifted as sources of moral formation of children, not even extended families, right? So there's this emphasis on the natural form being this pair that the authors are presenting as what the Quran is in fact guiding Muslims to do. So this is another kind of example of how the marriage manual works in terms of inserting Quran translations. So again, here we start, Abdul Rauf starts with nature. So the reason why, like Badawi, he argues that men are in charge of the family, take leadership over the family. It is probably because the husband's capability is not periodically checked. This is up here, is not periodically checked or interrupted by menstruation, childbearing, etc. That God has installed him as head of the family, right? And put him in charge. And then he includes a Quranic verse to emphasize right here, men are in charge of women because of the degree men are granted over women and because of their financial responsibility. Um, and so he uh, starts with nature, goes on to the rights and responsibilities in terms of financial, right? Financial responsibility. But then, in a kind of fascinating sort of back and forth, acknowledges that individual couples may come up with like a totally different model, right? So while it might be good and desirable and even the natural thing for men to assume total financial responsibility over the family, he also then presents a series of cases where and circumstances where it would be necessary for women to work or, in fact, to take on a kind of professional or educational capacity outside the home to do so. And it's this considerable latitude that is given to individual couples, right, as that companionate pair to negotiate their Islamic obligations to God, but also to one another. Okay, so that is how the Quran translations are working in the text. They're kind of structural features. The other piece that is happening within these pamphlets are the use of religious texts in the context of the culture wars. So we think about the culture wars in the 1970s as having a couple key features. One are debates around racial integration and civil rights. There's also then the gender and sexuality bucket, which would include reproductive rights, gender roles, and sexuality. And then the third one, which I somehow omitted here, is prayer in schools. So the gender and sexuality bucket is the one that these pamphlets are most concerned with and that US Muslims are primarily and directly concerned with, less so than with race. Um, and this emerges more broadly, these sorts of this constellation of gender and sexuality, reproductive rights in the 1970s as an area of immense kind of catastrophizing rhetoric, legal battles, broader kinds of mobilization of what we now call the Christian right. And the marriage manual takes these up quite directly. I'm going to actually just have to say I was surprised at how directly they are taken up, both for the arguments, which are now so familiar, but also just the directness with which the manual is responding to political developments of the 1970s and seeking then to make an argument vis-a-vis the Quran about them. So the manual starts in this section on reproduction and abortion with this notion that Abdul Rauf argues that the Quran, right, the notion that the fetus grows and develops in stages was derived from the Quran. Okay, so this idea that not only is the Quran describing something that is consonant with science, but also that in fact prefigures science in a way. And again, these are arguments that are not new or innovative necessarily for Abdul Rauf. What I'm interested in is then how these kinds of arguments are marshaled towards particular ends for prescribing a Muslim way of life. And so then he provides the verse that describes the process of formation from clay, from a clot, right, into flesh, into bone, etc. And from there, right, we see this kind of that not in addition to noting, right, the Qur'an's relationship to what is natural, scientific, medically based, the manual then goes on to note differences of opinions among pre-modern Muslim jurists about when the fetus is considered to possess a soul. And so we have this interesting interplay between the use of a medical term, right, the medical term fetus, alongside Islamic terminology about the soul and when that, right, when that sort of enters into life, when that life becomes fully animated. And so Abdul Rauf then uses the text to argue that abortion should then be limited to early weeks and only if a mother's life is threatened. Marriage in Islam, as he notes, right, is being published just as states were loosening restrictions on abortion, but prior to the Roe v. Wade decision, which had previously protected abortion interestingly, through different stages of fetal development. So Raouf's arguments are very closely tied to American debates about reproduction, about gender roles, et cetera. They are Islamic arguments, but they are also arguments that are part and parcel of a particular social context in which the citing of religious texts, such as, right, of scripture, is very much becoming part of the broader political discourse around the legal apparatus in the United States. From there, the manual pivots to a discussion of what Abdul Rauf considers to be the most threatening to a Muslim way of life in the United States, and that's the emergence of LGBTQ queer form of expressions, right, of identity. And so again, he argues here, he invokes the story of Lot, provides those verses in translation, and then goes on to say that what the problem with what this new emerging forms of sexuality are is this idea of homosexuality being unnatural. So again, the pivot towards what is natural and what is good, what is desirable vis-a-vis the Qur'an. And so while we have seen, again, this is part of these tensions that I began the talk with. On the one hand, marriage manual, the marriage manual is a highly optimistic text, right? It very much is about the kind of openness of Islam, the ability of Muslim families to thrive in the United States, all these different kinds of unions that he made happen. And yet on the one hand ends on this is kind of comes toward the end of the pamphlet, are like really dire warnings about the threats posed by gender and sexuality, developments within gender roles, within sexuality, sexual and sexual orientation preferences and identities as they are emerging in the 1970s, that this kind of tension between those two tacks, right, in the context of a prescriptive pamphlet that is promising to kind of tell a kind of definitive story for Muslims. All right, so I want to end by thinking about this kind of aspirations of universality and how these pamphlets use the Quran to sort of accomplish these. So as I mentioned, the language piece is key, that English translations are one of the key places where I see the enactment of this kind of aspiration for universality that extends for Badawi in terms of diminishing divisions among Muslims on all kinds of lines, right? So part of this is about creating a unified vision for Islam in America. The MSA also had broad aspirations in terms of global Islam, which I'm happy to talk about as well. Abdul Rauf's aspirations of universality are slightly different. So because he is so engaged in many of these unions that are cross-religious lines, he aspires to this idea of finding real and sincere human brotherhood, finding common ground with other religious communities. So he leans into the natural scientific discourse as a way of meeting both his Muslim and non-Muslim audiences, which he sees not just on polemical grounds, but highly relational grounds, right? He's thinking about family relationships and how to navigate those with respect to religious difference. But in both cases, the Quran in translation is providing the key to what is natural and therefore good and desirable for Muslims. All right, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.